When you think of Florida, like really think of it, what's one of the first images that pops into your mind? I mean, come on. Besides the beaches and theme parks, maybe it's a flamingo, right? Those tall, pink, quirky looking birds that are everywhere on lawn ornaments, postcards, even those tacky souvenir t-shirts. But have you ever wondered if they really belong here? Like, do flamingos actually live in Florida, or are they just, some symbol we latched onto? Well, here's the thing. The answer is a little more complicated than you might think. And today we're diving deep into it. We're talking way back before the flamingo became the face of every tourist trap from Miami to Orlando. Turns out these birds have a history in Florida that's honestly pretty wild. And if you're like me, you probably had no clue that for a long time. We almost lost them completely. So today on Old Florida, now we're going to break down everything you never knew about these fabulous feathered friends from their prehistoric days to the wild plume trade that nearly wiped them out, and how they're surprised, like actually making a comeback. They're not just for your lawn anymore, folks. All right, let's get into it. This is going to be a fun one, so grab a drink, kick back, and let's talk flamingos.
Welcome to Old Florida Now, where we uncover the rich history and hidden stories of the Sunshine State. Each episode will explore the people, places, and events that shaped Florida's past. Let's dive in.
All right, so let's take it back a bit, like way back to a time before Florida was all about, Disney World and pastel-colored motels. I'm talking about when this place was mostly wild wetlands, and believe it or not, flamingos were just here, and not just a couple either. Nah, we're talking huge colonies, hundreds, maybe even thousands of these tall pink birds strutting around like they own the place. Yeah, so flamingos, they were pretty common back then. You'd find them all over, especially in the Everglades, the Florida Keys, and the coastal marshes. And honestly, it makes sense, right? Florida was like the perfect spot for them. All that shallow water full of the shrimp and algae that actually give them that pink color, which is kind of wild when you think about it. But yeah, flamingos weren't just visitors. They were native here. Like, this was their home turf. Imagine looking out across a salt marsh or the Everglades, and you'd see these giant flocks of flamingos. It must have been a pretty amazing sight, and kind of hard to picture now because we're so used to seeing them as decorations instead of, actual wild birds. So like, these flamingos weren't just chilling in the Keys for vacation. They were thriving here long before we started making them into lawn ornaments. I mean, some folks even believe flamingos have been in Florida for, forever. They're in old art and descriptions from explorers. They were part of the landscape, but as we'll get into later, that all changed real fast once humans got involved. So here's where things get pretty interesting. I'm sure most of you have heard of John James Audubon, right? The famous bird guy, like the bird guy. He's basically a legend when it comes to documenting North America's wildlife. And turns out he had quite a bit to say about flamingos in Florida too. So back in the 1830s, Audubon actually traveled to Florida, which, by the way, was still like this super wild, untamed place at the time. There weren't highways or theme parks, just lots of swamps and mangroves. And one of the birds he really wanted to see up close was the flamingo. Now, Audubon, being the detailed guy he was, described these huge flocks of flamingos. Like, imagine bright pink birds all over the place, especially in the Keys and Everglades. He even sketched them, capturing these tall, lanky, kind of ridiculous birds in all their glory. And what's wild is that his drawings and observations really helped put flamingos on the map, both for scientists and the general public. These birds weren't just some oddity. They were like a major part of Florida's ecosystem back then. And you got to think, right? This was before all the hunting and habitat loss. So flamingos were everywhere. Audubon's sketches really give us a glimpse into that, early Florida vibe. It's like, even then, flamingos were kind of a big deal. Okay, so here's a fun one. For the longest time, people thought the flamingos we'd spot in Florida weren't like real Floridians. The story was that these birds were just visiting from the Bahamas or Cuba, just passing through for a little vacation in the Sunshine State. Turns out, though, that's actually kind of wrong. I mean, yeah, there are flamingos in the Bahamas and Cuba, no doubt. But the idea that, Florida's flamingos were just temporary visitors, well, recent research has pretty much debunked that. They weren't just migratory. These birds were actually native to Florida, like full-time residents, not just tourists. So here's what happened. For years, we didn't have a ton of solid evidence because, honestly, after the whole plume hunting thing in the late 1800s, which we'll touch on in a bit, they kind of disappeared. People just assumed that any flamingos seen after that must have been blown over here by storms or escaped from zoos or private collections. But now, thanks to newer studies, like tracking data from that famous bird, Conchi, remember him? If not, I'll give you the story on him soon. But in other archival records, we know these birds were part of Florida's natural landscape all along. It's kind of crazy, right? We went from thinking they were just seasonal guests to realizing they were Florida natives the whole time. It's like flamingos have as much claim to Florida as the manatees or the gators. Just took us a while to give them their proper due. Anyway, I just love how something like that, like a tiny myth, can change the whole story we tell about a place. And now we're seeing more flamingos around Florida again, which honestly is kind of poetic. All right, so let's get into one of the darker chapters of flamingo history in Florida, the plume trade. Now, I know it sounds like some fancy industry, right? But honestly, it was a pretty brutal business back in the late 1800s. Basically, in the late 19th century, feathers became super trendy. And I'm not just talking about a few feathers here and there. We're talking about women's fashion, where folks were wearing these massive hats just covered in feathers, bright, colorful ones from all kinds of birds, especially flamingos. And the demand for these feathers got so intense that they became like worth more than gold. Seriously, an ounce of flamingo feathers could fetch you a small fortune. But of course, with all that money on the line, hunters went, well, kind of nuts. Thousands of flamingos were hunted down just for their feathers. They weren't interested in the birds themselves, just the plumage. And the worst part, a lot of these hunters would shoot entire flocks, sometimes wiping out hundreds of birds at once, all to get their hands on those bright pink feathers. It's wild to think about now, but there were entire colonies of flamingos in places like the Everglades that just vanished. Florida went from having these huge flocks of flamingos everywhere to almost none in like just a few decades. It was one of the fastest and most devastating declines for any species in the state. Oh, and it wasn't just flamingos either. Other birds like egrets and spoonbills were also targeted. It was a pretty dark time for wildlife in Florida. Thankfully, by the early 20th century, the government started stepping in with protections like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918, but by then, flamingos were practically gone from the wild. So yeah, while we all love seeing flamingos today, it's important to remember that they nearly disappeared completely, all because of fashion. So if hunting wasn't enough to push flamingos to the edge, we humans had to throw habitat destruction into the mix. I mean, the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not kind to Florida's wetlands. The Everglades, a place that used to be like flamingo paradise, was slowly getting drained. Now you might be thinking, why would anyone want to drain the Everglades? Well, back then, people saw it as, wasted land. They figured, let's drain it, build on it, turn it into farmland, or make room for the expanding population. And that plan kind of worked, but at a huge cost. A lot of the natural wetland areas that flamingos and other birds like spoonbills and egrets needed to survive were just gone. These wetlands weren't just pretty scenery. They were critical, right? Flamingos depend on shallow waters where they can wade around and scoop up shrimp and algae. But when the wetlands started disappearing, so did the food and eventually the flamingos too. And it wasn't just the Everglades. Wetlands all over Florida were being drained and developed. These habitats, which used to be home to tons of wading birds, were shrinking fast. between the hunting for feathers and the loss of these ecosystems, flamingos didn't stand much of a chance. By the early 1900s, they were practically wiped out here. Now, we look at the Everglades today, and we're finally starting to understand just how important it is, not just for flamingos, but for all the wildlife that depends on it. The loss of that habitat was a huge blow, and it's taken decades to even start recovering. Anyway, it's crazy to think how much damage was done in such a short time, right? Draining wetlands to make room for progress, but at what cost? All right, so by the early 1900s, flamingos in Florida were, well, pretty much gone. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around, right? Like, they went from being everywhere, these big, colorful flocks in the Everglades and Keys, to almost nowhere. And the thing is, it wasn't just the hunting or the habitat loss that did it. It was the combination of all that feather trade, draining the wetlands. It was just too much for them to bounce back from. And so by the time the 1910s rolled around, spotting a wild flamingo in Florida was basically unheard of. I mean, sure, you could see them in places like Hialeah Park, which I'll touch on in a bit, but those were captive flamingos. The ones flying free, they were pretty much gone, extinct from the wild in Florida. Now, the government eventually stepped in finally with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918. This was like a big deal for a lot of birds, including flamingos. The act made it illegal to hunt, capture, or sell migratory birds and their feathers. So, yeah, it put an end to that whole plume trade. So, but by the time this law came into play, Florida's wild flamingos were already out of here. Maybe I'll do an episode focused just on the act. We'll see. It's kind of bittersweet, right? The act helped protect tons of species, but it came a little too late for our pink friends. Flamingos were gone, and for most of the 20th century, people just assumed they were, never really coming back. Of course, we know now that's not completely true, but back then, they were pretty much written off as a part of Florida's past, just like that. And so, all right, by the time the 1930s rolled around, wild flamingos in Florida were pretty much a thing of the past. But funny enough, if you wanted to see flamingos back then, there was still one place to go, Hialeah Park. Yeah, the racetrack, kind of random, right? But it's true, the Hialeah Park racetrack became like the place to see flamingos in Florida. They started this captive breeding colony, and pretty soon they had all these pink birds hanging out on the grounds. I mean, imagine it. You're at the horse races and just casually watching flamingos wading around in a pond nearby. It was wild. And honestly, this was one of the only ways people could see flamingos in Florida for a long time. These birds became a huge part of the track's identity. In fact, they became kind of symbolic for Florida in general. Like, people started associating the flamingos at Hialeah with the whole Florida vibe. So even though the wild population was basically gone, these captive flamingos kept the image of the bird alive in the state. You'd see them on postcards, advertisements, all that touristy stuff. It's like they became this weird symbol of Florida's exotic side, like even though they weren't really in the wild anymore. It's just crazy to think about. We wiped out their natural population, but at the same time, we kept them around in these little pockets, like a zoo attraction almost, and they just became part of the Florida brand. The Hialeah flamingos were it for decades. All right, so here's where things get really interesting. In 2015, something kind of cool happened down in the Florida Keys. A flamingo named Conchi became a bit of a celebrity. Yeah, so Conchi was this wild flamingo that got rescued from an airport in the Keys. Poor guy was just hanging out in a place he shouldn't have been. So wildlife folks stepped in. Now, they didn't just rescue him. They actually fitted him with a tracking device, which was a big deal. I mean, up until that point, we didn't really know a whole lot about flamingos in Florida. Were they just passing through? Were they sticking around? No one really knew. But Conchi gave scientists a ton of new info. So for the first time, we were able to see where a flamingo was going in real time. And Conchi didn't disappoint. He was all over the place, moving between the Keys, Everglades, and some other spots. This one bird taught us more about flamingo behavior in Florida than basically the last 100 years of observation. It was wild. and because of Conchi, scientists started realizing that, hey, maybe flamingos aren't just visitors after all. Maybe they belong here like they used to. His movements proved that flamingos could still use these wetlands and habitats, places we thought were like long lost to them. I mean, we owe a lot to Conchi. He really gave us a fresh perspective on flamingos in Florida. Who knew one little bird could do so much, right? So here's a wild story. Literally in 2023, Hurricane Idalia hit Florida. And like with a lot of hurricanes, it didn't just bring strong winds and rain. It brought flamingos. Yeah, you heard me right. Flamingos, dozens of them. Now, it's not unheard of for hurricanes to carry birds with them. Storms can push wildlife into places they wouldn't normally go. But this time, something different happened. Flamingos started showing up all over Florida, from the Panhandle to the East Coast. I mean, we're talking over 100 wild flamingos sighted in early 2024, which honestly, that's huge. It wasn't just a random sighting here or there. There were reports of flamingos in places like the Florida Bay, Pine Island, even the Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge. And the thing is, these birds didn't just leave after the storm. They stayed. Birders were seeing them weeks, even months after the hurricane passed, which got everyone, including scientists, really excited. And now some folks think this could be a sign that flamingos are making a real comeback in Florida. After all, the habitats are getting healthier again, and these birds are starting to find their way back, whether it's on their own or with a little help from Mother Nature's not so gentle hand. So yeah, while we definitely don't welcome hurricanes, Hurricane Idalia might have accidentally played a part in helping the flamingos return to the Sunshine State. Who knows? Maybe in a few years, we'll be seeing flocks of wild flamingos here again, just like in the old days. So we talked about Conchi earlier, right? The flamingo with the tracking device that really shook things up for scientists. Well, believe it or not, Conchi's story actually played a big role in getting flamingos officially reclassified as a native species in Florida. Yeah, that's right. After years of folks thinking they were just passing through from the Caribbean or Cuba, we now know they belong here. So here's how it went down. Conchi's tracking data, along with some historical reports and aerial surveys, showed that flamingos weren't just these rare visitors anymore. They were actually sticking around and using Florida's wetlands again, especially in places like the Everglades and the Keys. And with that info, scientists were able to make a pretty solid case that, hey, flamingos aren't just tourists. They've always been home here. And in 2018, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission finally agreed. They reclassified flamingos as a native species, which might sound like just a label, but it's actually a big deal. It means they get more protections now, and it bolsters efforts to restore their habitats, making sure they have the right conditions to thrive. You know, it's funny. For the longest time, people thought flamingos didn't really belong in Florida, even though they were once everywhere. But thanks to a single bird and some pretty impressive detective work by scientists, we've come full circle. Flamingos are officially part of Florida again. And with the conservation efforts in place, there's a good chance we'll be seeing more of them in the wild. Pretty cool how one bird can change the whole narrative, right? So, you know, if we're talking about flamingos making a comeback, we got to talk about the Everglades. Like, it's the spot. I mean, the Everglades used to be flamingo paradise, but after decades of, you know, drainage projects and development, it got pretty rough for them. Wetlands were disappearing and the flamingos didn't really have anywhere to go. But over the last few years, there's been a lot of work to restore the Everglades, and it's starting to pay off. These restoration projects are all about bringing back the natural water flow. So, you know, things like wading birds and other wildlife can get back to using the habitats they lost. And flamingos, well, they're finally benefiting from all this hard work. I mean, it's not just about like saving one species. It's about creating the conditions where the whole ecosystem can thrive again. Wetlands are getting healthier, and that means more shrimp and other critters flamingos love to snack on. And the cool thing is, as these restoration efforts keep going, we're seeing more and more flamingos come back to places like Florida Bay and the Everglades, it's kind of like this huge team effort between scientists, conservationists, and even lawmakers to make sure these habitats are protected long term. And it's working. Florida's wetlands are slowly coming back to life, and so are the flamingos. They're starting to, make themselves at home again. It's just nice to see how a place like the Everglades, which was so close to being lost, is now bouncing back. And with it, the flamingos are getting a second chance to thrive here, just like they used to. So while we're seeing flamingos make a comeback here in Florida, a lot of that success is actually connected to what's been going on in places like the Caribbean and Mexico. Turns out they've been working on flamingo conservation for years, and the results have been honestly pretty amazing. Take Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, for example. They've got one of the largest flamingo breeding colonies in the world. And over the last few decades, there's been this huge effort to protect those wetlands, to make sure the birds have safe places to breed and feed. And it's working big time. The flamingo population there has been bouncing back, and it's been strong enough that birds from that region are starting to wander a little farther. Same thing goes for places like the Bahamas and Cuba. Conservation programs have helped stabilize flamingo populations in those areas, and some of those birds have been spotted flying over to Florida. So what we're seeing here in Florida isn't just some random resurgence. It's part of this bigger regional recovery. Birds from these successful colonies are starting to explore more, and Florida's wetlands are looking good again. So as I've been saying, they're coming back. It's kind of cool when you think about it, how these conservation efforts in the Caribbean are like directly impacting us here. It's all connected, and it shows just how important these regional conservation networks are, because without the work they've been doing in places like Mexico and the Bahamas, we probably wouldn't be seeing so many flamingos making their way back to Florida. Conservation really is a team effort, and it's paying off in ways we didn't even expect. All right, so let's switch gears a little and talk about how the flamingo went from nearly disappearing from Florida's wild to becoming this like massive symbol of the state. I mean, you see them everywhere now, right? Flamingos are on T-shirts, postcards, plastic lawn ornaments, you name it. They're basically the unofficial mascot of Florida. But what's kind of wild is that just a century ago, these birds were on the verge of extinction here. After all the hunting and habitat loss we talked about earlier, flamingos had pretty much vanished from the state. But somehow over the years, their image didn't disappear with them. Instead, it totally blew up. So how did flamingos go from nearly gone to everywhere? Well, part of it started with places like Hialeah Park, where those captive flamingos we mentioned kept the birds in the public eye. And then in the mid 20th century, something weird happened. Flamingos got picked up by pop culture and became a huge symbol of Florida's tourist boom. I mean, think about it. Florida in the 50s and 60s was the spot for vacations, and the tourism industry just ran with the flamingo image. You had those bright pink plastic flamingos popping up on lawns across the country. And fun fact, those were actually created by an artist named Don Featherstone in 1957. Kind of fitting, right? Featherstone. But yeah, flamingos started showing up in advertising, motel signs, postcards, basically anywhere that screamed Florida. Even if people weren't seeing wild flamingos, they were definitely seeing flamingo vibes everywhere they looked. And over time, it just stuck. Flamingos went from this rare, almost mythic bird to being like the ultimate kitschy icon of Florida's fun, sunny side. And honestly, even with the wild population starting to bounce back now, that cultural symbol is still going strong. It's kind of funny how these birds nearly disappeared, but instead of fading away, they became this massive, almost larger than life symbol of Florida. So if we're talking about flamingos as a Florida symbol, we have to dive in a little deeper on the most iconic version of them, the plastic flamingo. I mean, you've probably seen them on lawns all over the place, especially here in Florida. Those bright pink, kind of goofy looking birds. They're everywhere. I know I touched on it a little, but really, how did they even become a thing? Well, the story of the plastic flamingo starts back in 1957 when this guy named Don Featherstone, who I mentioned briefly, designed the first plastic flamingo for a company called Union Products. It was meant to be a fun, affordable way for folks to add a little tropical flair to their front yards, and it worked. They took off. What's funny is that these plastic flamingos became like the ultimate symbol of Florida's kitsch culture. You know what I mean? That over the top, almost tacky, but totally fun side of Florida where everything is a little exaggerated, a little too colorful, but in the best way possible. These lawn ornaments became shorthand for the carefree, sunny Florida lifestyle that everyone up north wanted a piece of during the big tourism booms in the 50s and 60s. They became this symbol of a fun tropical getaway, even if most people had never seen a real flamingo in the wild. It's like the plastic ones became more famous than the actual birds. So yeah, these pink lawn flamingos kind of took on a life of their own. They represent this quirky, nostalgic part of Florida's identity. And honestly, even today, you still see them popping up, whether it's people embracing the kitsch or just having a little fun with their decor. It's crazy to think that a simple plastic bird ended up being such a big part of Florida's image, but hey, that's Florida for you. So remember when I talked about how over 100 wild flamingos were spotted across Florida earlier this year? And this wasn't just a one-time thing. And I got to say, this has people wondering, could we finally see breeding colonies come back to Florida? Now, it's been a long time since Florida had any real established flamingo colonies. I mean, we're talking like over a century since they were nearly wiped out. But with these sightings, there's a lot of hope that these birds might not just be passing through anymore, that they might actually start nesting here again. And the thing is, conditions are looking pretty good for them. Wetlands like the Everglades are being restored, which is huge for flamingos because they need those shallow waters to feed and nest. And plus, with climate change and rising sea levels shifting habitats around, there's a chance that these birds might find Florida's wetlands to be just the right place to settle down. Of course, it's still too early to say for sure, but scientists are definitely optimistic. They're keeping an eye on these flocks, tracking their movements, and crossing their fingers that we'll see some actual breeding colonies pop up. And if that happens, man, that would be something, right? To have wild flamingos not just visiting, but living and breeding in Florida again, like they did way back in the day. So yeah, the future is looking a little brighter for these as pink beauties. Let's hope they're here to stay. So while it's great to see more wild flamingos making their way back to Florida, it's not all smooth sailing. These birds, like so many other species, are facing some pretty big challenges ahead, mostly thanks to climate change and habitat destruction. Let's start with climate change. Rising sea levels, stronger storms, shifting temperatures. It's all having an impact, especially in places like the Everglades. I mean, flamingos need these shallow wetlands to feed and nest, right? But if those areas get flooded out by salt water or just disappear, it's going to be tough for flamingos to survive here long term. And it's not just the water levels. Habitat destruction is still a big issue too. A lot of the wetlands and coastal areas that flamingos and other wading birds depend on have been drained, developed, or damaged over the last century. Sure, we've got restoration projects going on, and that's awesome, but there's still a lot of work to do. That's where these conservation efforts come in. Groups are working hard to protect and expand the habitats flamingos need. They're restoring wetlands, improving water flow in the Everglades, and keeping an eye on climate-related changes that could affect these birds. It's a bit of a race against time, honestly, but there's hope that with enough effort and maybe a little luck, flamingos can find a way to thrive here again. I guess in the end, it's all about balance, right? We've got to make sure we're doing enough to keep these habitats healthy, not just for the flamingos, but for all the wildlife that depends on them. And if we can pull that off, maybe we'll see even more of these pink beauties sticking around Florida for the long haul. All right, folks, what a journey, huh? We've covered the whole flamingo saga from their days as native residents of Florida's wetlands to almost being wiped out completely by hunters to them becoming this kind of cultural icon with their pink plastic cousins, and now hopefully their real life comeback. It's pretty wild to think about how these birds, once a symbol of what we nearly lost, have found their way back into the story of Florida. From the vibrant flocks in the Everglades to the lawn ornaments that became a quirky part of Florida's identity, flamingos have always managed to stay in the conversation, even when they weren't really here. And now, with over 100 wild flamingos spotted in the state again, it feels like we're witnessing something special, a real shot at bringing back these beautiful birds to their rightful home. But the question is, what's next? Will we see flamingos become permanent residents again, with breeding colonies thriving across Florida, or will the challenges of climate change and habitat loss keep them on the edge? Only time will tell, but one thing's for sure, flamingos are more than just a symbol of Florida's past. They might just be part of its future too, and I, for one, can't wait to see how that story unfolds. Thanks for joining me today on Old Florida Now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share it with a fellow Florida history buff. I'm Bo Carter, and I'll catch you next time as we dive into more stories from Florida's wild and wonderful past.
Thanks for listening to Old Florida Now. Stay tuned for more stories from the Sunshine State's past. Until next time.